They say some movies are cursed, that there is something lingering behind the scenes, something you don't see in the trailers or the credits, growing into its own version of folklore with each retelling of the story. Poltergeist is one such film where the line between the script and real life blurred, and the horror did not stay confined to the screen. Poltergeist became an urban legend that studios could market and articles could twist, and audiences could therefore make sense of the continuous grief that plagued this production. Because in Hollywood, tragedy sells, and in 1982, Poltergeist hit theaters. It was directed by Tobe Hooper, but it was created and largely influenced by Steven Spielberg, who was the producer on the film. Poltergeist told the story of a suburban family whose home was plagued by aggressive spirits that eventually abduct their youngest daughter, Carol Ann. Spielberg wanted realism in this film. He encouraged the writers to talk to actual psychics and ghost hunters for inspiration in order to ground this movie in something believable.
Stephen had us meeting with psychics and ghost hunters and all kinds of the most bizarre people we'd ever imagined. There was some guy up in the hills who we met with who supposedly could see ghosts. And we were wandering around some old mansion, and he goes, "See, there's one there." And we'd look up, and it'd be, there would be nothing there. And we go, "Oh yeah."
For true inspiration, Spielberg and his writers reached back to their own childhood fears.
We just thought about everything that scared us as kids, nightmares, fantasies, dreams, whatever. And we all contributed stories about, the usual things kids are afraid of, the dark closet, what's under the bed.
And it worked. The movie was a massive success, but with that success came rumors of a curse. Production started in 1981, and things were weird on the Poltergeist set from the get-go. Oliver Robbins, the actor who played Robbie, has one of the most unsettling behind-the-scenes stories. There's an iconic scene in the movie where he's being attacked by a creepy clown doll under his bed, which actually turned into a real-life emergency. A mechanical version of the doll was built, but it wasn't that great because the animatronics arm on the clown doll malfunctioned and started tightening around this poor kid's neck. He was literally being choked on set, but the crew thought that he was just acting super well, but he was on the verge of becoming unconscious, which the crew realized when his face started turning red and he couldn't breathe. Spielberg intervened, prying the mechanism off the kid's throat, and thankfully he was okay, but that was honestly just the beginning of the tragedies that transpired on this movie. JoBeth Williams, who played the mom Diane, was filming the infamous pool scene where she's flailing around in murky water and all these skeletons rise to the surface. Well, it turns out that these skeletons were not plastic props like she assumed. They were actual human remains. Allegedly, these were imported from India because apparently it's cheaper to buy real bones than the cost of hiring an artist to make fake ones. And it wasn't just this production that did that. There were actually quite a few horror movie productions that were using real skeletons back in the day. Like in House on Haunted Hill, Frankenstein. It was really just more advantageous for lower budget B films. But this poor actor, she didn't even find out until after they had already finished filming that these were real skeletons that she was in the water with, and I don't know. I feel like that's something that I would personally want to be aware of if I had to swim around with them in a pool for a movie scene.
I assumed that these were not real skeletons. I assumed that they were prop skeletons, made out of plastic or rubber. I found out, as did the whole crew, that they were using real skeletons. And I think everybody got very creeped out by the idea of that.
But once that tidbit of production information came out, a lot of people thought that this thrifty prop move was spiritually disrespectful. Like, you're already shooting a film about restless spirits and desecrated graves, and now you're literally surrounding yourself with legitimate skeletons for the sake of realism. Like, if bad vibes were going to cling to anything on this movie, it would definitely be that. It also kind of kicked off this whole thread of, did the movie bring this energy energy in, or was it already there? Kind of aura that was haunting the entire production. Dominique Dunne, who played the eldest daughter Dana, became the first person associated with Poltergeist whose death sparked whispers of a curse. She was only 22 when her ex-boyfriend, John Sweeney, strangled her outside her home. Dominique had already left him after experiencing escalating abuse. There's one story where John Sweeney reportedly gave Dominique a chocolate mask carved in her likeness, thinking that that gesture was going to entice her to come back to him. Like, he just could not let her go. One night just before Halloween in 1982, after she had been rehearsing lines with actor David Packer, Sweeney showed up at her house. The two were outside, eventually started fighting, and in the chaos created, David turned up the Poltergeist soundtrack to drown out the noise, which is a choice, but when he heard Dominique scream, he called the police, but apparently the police told him that the house was outside of the police department's jurisdiction. So David apparently called a friend saying that if he died tonight, it was John Sweeney that did it. David went out the back door, trying to slip away unnoticed, and saw Sweeney crouching by some bushes, telling David to call the police. By the time the police arrived, Sweeney met the police with his hands up, saying that he killed his girlfriend and then tried to kill himself. Dominique wasn't dead, however, and was taken to the hospital where she remained in a coma for several days before unfortunately being taken off life support on November 4th, 5 months to the day after the release of Poltergeist. In the aftermath, despite the brutality of the act against his girlfriend, Sweeney only served 2.5 years in prison. Dominique's father, Dominic Dunne, an investigative journalist, wrote about his entire experience for Vanity Fair in 1984, channeling his grief into an absolutely heartbreaking article exposing the system that really loves to protect violent men and paint the victims, usually women, as the true culprit. I think to call this brutal tragedy a piece of the Poltergeist curse really lessens what happened to Dominique and diminishes the horror that happens within abusive and toxic relationships, that really showcases the reality that a lot of women face at the hands or the voices of their partner. And it's like the Poltergeist curse, or whatever the rumor is that's following this movie, like, that did not cause this to happen. Fast forward to the production of Poltergeist 2 in 1985. Several incidences occurred that ultimately just added to the rumors surrounding the franchise's so-called curse. First, Julian Beck, who played the cult leader Kane, filmed all of his scenes whilst battling stomach cancer. In the movie, Reverend Kane had a gaunt, frail appearance with sunken eyes, giving him a skeleton-like visage. I read that he looked so scary on set that the first time Heather O'Rourke met him, she started crying out of fear. But Julian Beck had been fighting cancer for a couple years prior to filming, and this haunting appearance, as it's come to be known, is due to the cancer taking its toll on his body. And this was ultimately his last film appearance, passing away 8 months prior to the sequel's release. The next strange occurrence on set involves Will Sampson, an indigenous shaman who practiced traditional medicine. He was cast in the film as Taylor, a shaman who helps the family against the evil spirit. And one day, Will knew that something was off on set. He'd been sensing a dark energy around the production because weird things were happening on set this time around too. The cast and crew members felt like the energy was off, equipment was malfunctioning, actors were feeling way more exhausted than they should have been, and so Will, being a shaman, apparently traced this to the skeleton props, the real skeletons, that they were using for some of the scenes. So he offered to perform a ceremonial exorcism based within his spiritual practice. Apparently he was granted the go-ahead to do this, performed the exorcism that night, and it's been said that all of the production issues stopped the next day. But then, a year after the film's release, Will Sampson died at age 53 due to complications during a lung and heart transplant. He'd been struggling with chronic illness that led to malnutrition and severe organ issues, But that didn't stop some people from thinking that it was the curse that had gotten him. That because of the exorcism he performed, Will had thus taken on the negative energy himself whilst cleaning the space. And then others say that Will gave the film industry a spiritual warning that it didn't want to hear. Because it is no secret that Hollywood has a long history of exploiting indigenous spirituality for aesthetic or mystical effect, whilst ignoring the deeper meaning and traditions behind them. One character that comes to mind is John Redcorn from King of the Hill. While the show is satirical in nature, his role as the stereotypical mystical native massage therapist becomes a running joke, which really mirrors how Hollywood often flattens indigenous characters into spiritual sidekicks or symbols, rather than treating them as full authentic people. So when Will Sampson performed a ceremonial exorcism on set, it wasn't just for the plot, it was real, meaningful medicine. And the fact that it was followed by his death only added fuel to the idea that the energy he tried to cleanse didn't just disappear, it was transferred to him, igniting that curse even more. Poltergeist 3 was shot in Chicago's John Hancock Center in the spring of 1987, which even prior to filming played host to a number of eerie deaths, including a woman falling from her boyfriend's 90th floor apartment through a window that was reportedly designed to withstand any significant pressure. A radio station employee fell from the top of the building. A student fell from the 91st floor, and even during the building's construction, over 100 builders had died. More chaos followed, however, when the Poltergeist crew took up residence there to film the third movie. Director Gary Sherman broke his foot and ended up directing from a wheelchair. A stuntman's shins were ripped up when an underwater catapult device malfunctioned. The building engineer that was assisting with the film's production was found dead, sitting in his chair in the middle of his shift, no reason for it, and what was supposed to be a controlled explosion went into a full-blown, uncontrollable fire, where the firemen that were hired to be on set overseeing this reportedly ran for their lives, leaving a maintenance worker trapped in the building, where ultimately a stuntman ended up running back into the inferno to save the worker, and I guess also managed to save the film and the cameras as well. And then finally, production ended up going on hiatus for several months when 12-year-old Heather O'Rourke suddenly died. Heather O'Rourke was the heart of the Poltergeist series. She was the little girl who said, "They're here," the iconic line that would be widely known even today. But behind the scenes, Heather was struggling with health issues that no one fully understood. Doctors had diagnosed her with Crohn's disease, which is chronic inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract, and she was being treated with steroids. But that diagnosis turned out to be wrong, and what she really had was a congenital bowel obstruction, an undetected birth defect that led to sepsis, which was fatal. The morning she died, she'd been having trouble swallowing, and her mom noticed that Heather's hands were cold, so they took her to the hospital, and everything just happened so fast. A toxic infection of sepsis had taken over, and her body couldn't fight it. Her mother later said that just before she got the news from the doctors about her daughter's death, she had seen Heather appear right in front of her, out of nowhere, even though she knew that her daughter was in another room with the doctors. There was no way that Heather could have physically been in the room with her mother at that time. And her mother said that Heather had spoken to her, telling her that she would not be coming back. Heather died on February 1st, 1988, during the post-production process. Now, the film had been shot from April to June of 1987 with Heather present, but the ending needed to be reshot in 1988. So the director, the producers, they wanted to shelve the project, but the studio, MGM, demanded that the movie be completed because they had already sunk so much money into it, and it was so close to being done at that point. Gary Sherman said that the studio basically gave him an ultimatum like, either you finish this or we'll find someone else to. So with reluctance, it seems from the interview with the director, he wrote what was described as, quote, "a pathetic ending with a body double replacing Heather in her scenes. The hurriedness of this reshoot and the grief of such a recent loss of a child The ending and even the movie as a whole just didn't hit the same as the first Poltergeist movie or even the sequel, and the film itself proved to be a box office failure. But after Heather's death, people still kept linking the stories together as more than mere coincidences, as proof of a curse haunting the Poltergeist set. So between all three films, we have 4 cast members' deaths, an on-set exorcism, real human skeletons used as props, and numerous accidents and ominous events. There were even stories of tragic events taking place way after the fact. Richard Lawson, who played Ryan in Poltergeist, was aboard a plane that crashed in 1992 that killed 27 of the 51 people on board, but he survived. And then Lou Perryman was killed by an axe murderer in his own home in 2009. And again, these terrifying events are just muddled into this curse rhetoric. I just can't imagine if my family member or loved one was someone that was mentioned here and I go to their funeral and all I hear are whispers of a curse rumor. Like, this prolonged curse gossip is something that you would fall down in a Reddit rabbit hole had these movies been made today. I think back then, because information didn't circulate as widely and rapidly as it does now, that really lends itself to the perpetuity of the curse rumors back in the 80s. But ultimately, blaming a horror movie franchise for these tragedies risks exonerating the systems and people actually responsible. You know, abuse, misdiagnosis, unsafe work environments. Like, maybe at the end of the day, it's just easier to believe in ghosts than it is to have to deal with discomfort and the reality of grief. There is speculation that the first Poltergeist movie drew inspiration from real-life events known as the Herman House haunting in 1958. Whilst the filmmakers have not officially confirmed the Seaford Poltergeist, as it's also called, as a direct source, it's said that Spielberg got the idea for his script from the events that happened to this family, popularizing the term poltergeist. The Herman family lived in a ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood in Seaford, New York on Long Island, about 30 minutes from New York City. Lucille Herman, a registered nurse, was home at 3:30 p.m. on February 3rd in 1958 when her 2 children, Lucy and Jimmy, ages 13 and 12, came home from school and met their mother in the kitchen. Suddenly, chaos erupted. Bottles of liquid in different rooms began to pop their caps and spray liquid everywhere for no reason at all. No one saw the bottles move, but heard the caps pop and saw the liquid being sprayed all over the place. Bottles of bleach, shampoo, medicine, and holy water had been popped open with no signs of tampering. It was loud and really random, so Lucille called her husband James at work. And even though the situation was really weird, no one was hurt, so James decided that he was just going to investigate when he got home from work at his normal time. 7 p.m. rolls around, and on the train home, James figured that the reason for all these bottles exploding was likely due to some sort of chemical reaction, possibly a change in the humidity. But when he got home and examined the bottles closer, he saw that they were the type of caps that would screw on, so it didn't make sense to him how they could just pop off like that. The family was at a loss and decided to just kind of write this off as a weird occurrence. Well, 2 days later, the exact same thing happened again and again on Friday. But this time, James was starting to get suspicious. His son Jimmy was into science, and he was pretty certain that Jimmy figured out some way to rig the bottles to pop just to spook the family. So James decided to take that weekend to observe his son and try to catch him in the act. But more bottles just randomly started popping, and James couldn't figure it out because he had been watching his son Jimmy so observantly, keeping a close eye on him, that he couldn't figure out how Jimmy possibly could have done this, because there was really no other explanation to James other than Jimmy being the one that was behind it. And in his frustration, James accused his son of tampering with the bottles, which his son denied, getting emotional at the accusations. All of a sudden, a bottle goes off on its own right then and there. James spent some time trying to find hidden wires or some signs of trickery, but in the end, he actually went to the police station and, to no one's surprise, was having some trouble getting the police to take this seriously. because at this point, James was under the impression that something weird was going on. Eventually, an officer visited the Herman home, and lo and behold, a bunch of bottles started going off from our ghost friend Popper as he was starting to be called. So a detective was assigned to this case, which is so funny to me that that's what's preoccupying the police department's time. More bottle disturbances occurred, and on February 15th, a porcelain figurine shot 2 feet in the air before crashing down on the floor while the children and their relative were watching TV. And to everyone's amazement, the figurine was not broken. The media caught wind of this, and the family began receiving a lot of public attention. Reporters and photographers would flood the property, ready to catch the poltergeist in action at the Herman home. Lots of people wrote to the family with suggestions as to why this phenomenon was happening, with some correspondence becoming increasingly sinister and inappropriate. Meanwhile, the detective was still trying to move forward with this case and figure out the cause of these bottles mysteriously popping. Everything from magnetic fields, sonic booms from passing jets, underground vibrations, water levels, foreign matter in the bottles, air circulation, to even a downdraft through the fireplace was considered. But none of these panned out, and the occurrences continued. TV crews caught what I believe was the aftermath of a figurine hurling itself 12 feet across the room and smashing into a desk, but things only escalated from there. A large bookshelf had fallen face down, a record player moved 15 feet across the room, more statues and glass items were thrown across the room, and more people were starting to witness this phenomenon for themselves. That's when parapsychologists from Duke University came to the home, believing that telekinesis was the cause, that someone within the house was causing items to move and break and pop. Other researchers thought it was a whole-ass ghost because sometimes it would target religious items within the home, like the holy water, but the parapsychologists believed that in most of these situations, often this poltergeist activity is caused by a young person within the home at the height of puberty, unconsciously and unaware that they're making this happen, or apparently could also be from a menopausal woman. They said that it was usually a young girl who was behind this unknowingly, but when the researchers took note of Jimmy being at the scene of the disturbances 75% of the time, they thought he was likely behind it. Jimmy was observed by a doctor, and after spending some time with him, the doctor didn't observe anything strange about Jimmy at all. And during that time, there was also no activity from Popper the ghost. And then into March, a month after all of this activity had initially started, dishes were hurled across the kitchen, a table was flipped over, another bookcase was turned over, and more bottles would pop. And then after that, on March 10th, everything just stopped. More and more people came to check out the house and offer their theories as to why this activity had been occurring, but no one could definitively come up with an explanation. All in all, there were 70 reports of unusual activity during that time span of a month. And in the end, the family ended up moving away and, as far as we know, never really experienced much after the fact. Some believe that this is confirmation that the kids were behind it all, whether it was Jimmy alone or both he and his sister, thinking that if it was telekinetic activity, the guilt that they were most likely feeling over the whole situation could have stopped the emotional tension and thus the paranormal activity, or telekinetic activity. I guess the word paranormal would still apply there. But then also, if it was just a prank, some think that the attention that the family got also led to feelings of shame for the kids, and so therefore they stopped messing with the bottles altogether. Honestly, it wouldn't be too surprising if it did turn out that Jimmy was behind it all, but not in a telekinetic way. I don't think it's completely out of the realm of possibility to consider that this whole thing was well orchestrated by a kid that was just pulling some elaborate pranks. Joe Nickell, a prominent skeptic, revisited the Herman family case and suggested just that. Kids love attention, and constant media attention probably would have been really cool for a 12-year-old. Nickell suggested caps could have been loosened in a way that they would pop when no one was looking. Nickell thought that all of this was exacerbated by the adults in the room, all too eager to perpetuate the idea of these happenings being of the paranormal. But in the parapsychologist's report, they pointed out that on several occasions, even a good magic trick wouldn't have made it possible for the young boy to manipulate heavy objects to the lengths that they were. They apparently even asked the family to sit through lie detector tests, but the parents didn't want to subject their kids to that and declined. The movie would have only been loosely based on this family's experience in the barest way of a family being haunted by something unseen and popularizing the word poltergeist, which, if you're curious, originates from German, with the word poltern meaning to make sound or to rumble, and Geist meaning ghost. So it's a noisy ghost. Our brains love to look for patterns, and some of us are more inclined to believe in certain ways of magical thinking or superstitions. Believing in this instance that a place can be haunted simply because a horror movie was shot there, or that bad vibes can transfer from one thing to another. The idea of haunted objects and cursed sets is not new. Horror films are a perfect blend of long hours, intense emotions, and dark subject matter, causing people to latch onto an idea and run with it, making the spooky vibes last longer, and ultimately, this way of thinking is free and long-lasting PR. Even if it does come at the expense of real-life tragedies, do you really think that the studio is going to care as long as it's bringing in money? As I have said for a very long time to people in my life, ghosts and demons and the devil do not bother me. Movies about haunted dolls or religious horror do not frighten me at all when compared to real-life horror situations. To me, the scariest stories that you see are not always on screen. And it makes me wonder if part of why Poltergeist has accumulated such notoriety around this curse over the years is because it's easier to absorb tragic events and even distance ourselves from them when there's that fantasy element attached to it, that what if. Like, it's a lot easier to digest that an actor died of a curse on a horror movie than to think of the implications of domestic violence. So maybe the question isn't whether the Poltergeist set was truly cursed, but rather why we want it to be. It's easier to whisper about spirits and hexes than to confront the very human horrors that lurk behind the scenes. A curse lets us keep the cameras rolling without having to answer for what's happening when they're off. Because in Hollywood, myth sells better than truth, and maybe that's the real horror show.